Welcome to Multi-Cloud Powers the Future of IT, sponsored by Dell Technologies. Here's our host, Brian Borkowski, founder and editorial director of All Caps.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel today. Thanks for joining. I'm Brian Borzakowski, a longtime business journalist and founder and editorial director of All Caps Content. I'm pleased to be your host for today's event, where we're looking at how multi-cloud will power the future of IT. Before we begin, I'd just like to point out to you the dashboard at the bottom of the screen where you can find additional resources and submit questions to our panelists. Also, feel free to join the conversation on social using hashtag multi-cloud. And now let's get started. Joining me today are three esteemed guests who will shed light on this topic. Matt Baker, Senior Vice President, Corporate Strategy at Dell, Steve Duplessis, Founder and Lead Analyst at Enterprise Strategy Group, and Bill Long, Senior Vice President of Core Product Management at Equinix. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. We'll just start it off quickly by each of you just giving us a little bit of background on yourself, a little bit of context to why you're here. Steve, why don't we start with you, and then Bill and Matt.
Sure. Thanks, Brian. My name's Steve Duplessis. I founded ESG a little over 22 years ago, which means like Matt and probably Bill, we've been doing this way too long and have seen way too many things along the rides. And this is just the exciting next iteration of confusing IT things to talk about.
Awesome. And I'm Bill Long, so I'm in charge of product management here at Equinix. For folks who don't know Equinix, we have sort of an interesting view into multi-cloud because we're the place that a lot of it happens. We're the place that enterprises put their hardware, and it's also where a lot of the cloud providers put their edge nodes. So we have about 230 data centers around the world that people do this in, and gives us an interesting perspective into what's actually happening with multi-cloud.
Yeah, and I'm Matt Baker, head of corporate strategy at Dell Technologies, and we help power the multi-cloud. So let's get started and let's talk about it.
Thanks, guys. Steve, break this down for us. Let's start with the basics. What is multi-cloud, and why should customers care about this?
Well, multi-cloud is really distributed IT on steroids, and it typically happens organically, i.e. without a cohesive plan, which by default means that you're going to end up building IT silos that are even more complex than ever before. Because the business demands faster cycle times and DevOps wants everything now, nobody wants to wait anymore. And it's almost a ready, shoot, aim kind of thing. And that doesn't mean that everything's in the cloud, it's far from it. But it does mean companies tend to think cloud first. Interestingly, I think about 90% of companies implementing single or multi-cloud strategies also continue to have a serious commitment to on-premise kit because, quite frankly, it's easier and more successful operating than other things that they've been used to for in the cloud, for example. The good and the bad of what we're talking about today, I think I can sum up as saying the good is that we can stand up silos essentially on demand, and we can decide where those silos are going to go. The other good is that we don't have to physically manage the infrastructure itself, which is, again, a double-edged sword. We're still responsible for executing the application, but we have no control really over what the cloud provider is up there doing for us. The bad part, and I think the most interesting part of the dialogue, is that it sounds like a panacea, but really we create more operational complexity than we ever have before. We have less visibility into the back end. We have far more susceptibility to downtime. Another reason, by the way, multi-cloud is a necessity versus a single cloud. Data protection, business continuance, data integration, governance, data security, they're all harder as we add more silos with more interdependencies in our environment. And so, I guess the practical reality to this situation is we just have to deal with it. We're not going to go back in time. The genie's not going back into the bottle. Sometimes you got to, you get what you ask for here. And what we end up with is some enormous complexities that have to be dealt with and have to be addressed because we're not going to go back to 1975.
There's a lot of different kinds of clouds. There's a lot of talk about public cloud. And Matt, why multi-cloud? Why does multi-cloud being used to power the future of IT? Why would a company want to go that route as opposed to maybe just, adopting the public cloud?
Well, that's a really good question. And I'm going to sort of rattle through a few different reasons. First of all, cost. Public cloud, renting things is incredibly expensive. It has huge advantages in terms of elasticity, but it comes with a cost. And for folks who are operating an at-scale run rate business, it's sort of madness to rent the means of production for your business. So one side was everyone thought cloud was cheaper. It was cheaper if you're a startup with no existing sort of run rate business, but it's quite expensive. But it has its place. We're not saying otherwise. The second reason is that each cloud today specializes in some sort of technological angle. Google, for example, excels at data science. So different frameworks for advanced analytics, etc., are Google's strength. Microsoft integrates seamlessly with most business applications, and AWS has become expert in sort of online e-commerce web presence capabilities with a myriad of features. So utilizing multiple public clouds is, in essence, essential if you want to access the totality of innovation across the entire industry. The last is the speed of light. And in a world where increasingly people are looking to develop real-time automation, you cannot do real-time automation when latency exceeds, say, 5 to 8 milliseconds. And so locality, when you're trying to automate the things, becomes really important, which is why we talk not just about on-premises, which remains essential, and some of the research that Steve's firm has done shows that people are actually building more data centers, not fewer data centers. So on-prem remains a significant portion. Almost 90% or over 90% of applications remain on premises. So it's not going away. But we like to talk about not just on-prem, off-prem, which typically people come to mean as public cloud, but we talk about the third premise. It's everywhere that is not your data center and is not the public cloud. And this is because of that locality problem. If you want to automate safety systems in a factory, for example, the processing of the data, say you're utilizing cameras to ensure people are out of harm's way in a industrial setting, you can't wait 100, 200 milliseconds for it to tell you, don't throw that arm, you'll crush somebody. You want to do that immediately. And so locality, we think of speed of light as incredibly fast, and it is. But in computing terms, it's not nearly as fast as one might think. For example, if you take the two closest Amazon data center locations in the United States, it's in Northern Virginia and I believe Cincinnati, Ohio. It's about 200, 250 crow flies miles. But that is over 28 milliseconds of latency, well outside of the envelope for real-time automation. So there's a lot of reasons why multi-cloud. It has to do with the types of applications you're building, the cost of public cloud infrastructure, and frankly, access to all of the great innovation happening in our industry.
Yeah, just a quick anecdote. What's interesting is Steve was talking about sort of accidental versus purposeful multi-cloud. And I think when we saw, especially with the pandemic, the companies that had a purposeful multi-cloud strategy that had taken some of their hardware and put it in locations that were lower latency and high bandwidth capacity away from their internet service providers. They were in a place that they could access Zoom and Cisco WebEx, like the call we're on today. They were able to react much faster to the realities. It happened to be a pandemic today. Who knows, what kind of supply chain issue it will be tomorrow. But if you are purposeful with your multi-cloud strategy, it gives you a lot of sort of free option value while also decreasing your costs and increasing your performance, which were some of the points that Matt was making. So when you see what we see is the companies that are doing it purposeful, it really drives differential business outcomes for them on a day-to-day basis.
Bill's company is a great example of the third premises, which is you don't own the data center. They provide a data center for you. And because of their geographic reach, they can put you within milliseconds of every major city on Earth practically. So it's part of the arsenal of capabilities is colo providers who provide you sort of that geographic reach that you might not be able to get with facilities that you yourself own.
And if I could just chime in real quickly on that, I think it's a great point. And what people tend to forget is when we design for a cloud-oriented or cloud-first application, irrespective of what it is, people have a tendency to think that, well, if I just go to Google or if I just go to Amazon or if I just go pick your flavor of the day, all my problems get solved really quickly overnight. And I think both of you guys make a great point in that if you're not designed from the get-go, nothing's fundamentally changed from 1960. Right? And we had to figure out what we're trying to accomplish and then the means to accomplish it based on the value versus the risk associated with doing it. That hasn't changed. It's just that we think that we can, in the good old days, you could buy a box and it'll solve all your problems. Well, that wasn't true, right? And today you think you can just go flip a switch and turn on an AWS instance and that's going to solve all my problems. And that's not true either. And so I think, you guys bring up really good point. I think, Matt, you're talking more about edge, right? Edge-oriented type of functions that are not going to become less pervasive. They're going to completely dominate the world that we talk about at some point in the future, right? Everyone's kind of enamored with the autonomous driving vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. You're not going to wait 47 milliseconds for your car to not smash into a person walking across the road, right? It's not really acceptable. So meanwhile, that same vehicle might be integrated into a traffic system in a city that can wait those 47 seconds because it's 6 blocks away from the next light control or a fire engine turning on, things like that. So these things are all relative, and they become part of the reason that I talked a little earlier about the complexities is just think about that for a second, let alone a Mars rover or something like that. But think, just everyday occurrences that we do in life and take for granted are so much more complicated in this net new world. And we just started. Right? We really just started. So we kind of think about the perspective when somebody makes an inquiry to us about what should we be thinking about? We said, well, unfortunately, you have to think about everything. It's end to end, because even though you think you have maybe a plan in place that says, I just want to solve X, X changes. The goalposts keep moving. And so you've just got to be able to be fluid and dynamic in your thinking, let alone your implementation capabilities.
And Steve, just a quick follow-up. Are you getting more interest now since the pandemic? I mean, how has kind of the last 2 years maybe changed the conversation or got more people interested in learning more about the cloud in general, but also the multi-cloud?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. Forcing society, in our case, an IT society, to do things differently is always the way that we fundamentally get change. People don't change just because, other than people like Matt and I, who might have a little bit of ADD, that enjoy those dynamics. But fundamentally, right, companies don't change, business processes don't change, people don't change, habits don't change, even if they're wrong, even if they're painful, until they're forced to. So COVID, all of a sudden everybody had to work from home and we lost our minds. How are we going to do that? We'll never be able to do that. We're all going to die we'll never have jobs. Our companies are going to go out of business. It didn't happen, right? So we evolved by force, and the cloud was a natural recipient of some of those trends, right? Because all of a sudden, Dell couldn't stop selling. Dell couldn't stop staying in business. Equinix stayed in business, right? They did things fundamentally differently because of force of nature, out there, but they still had to do business. And I think that was true universally. And people went from, it sounds like it was 100 years ago, but it was, you remember it was only 2. IT transformation happened overnight, faster than anything I've ever seen in this business. It literally happened overnight because it had to, not because people wanted to, because they had to, if that answers your question.
Talking about the past trends over the past 2 years, I think as people have been forced to move into a multi-cloud environment, the toolkits that are available now, where in a lot of the sort of cloud 1.0, the orchestration of workloads and the infrastructure are so tightly bundled together. But now that people want to be in this multi-cloud world, they're decoupling the orchestration with like VMware vSphere and EKS Anywhere, that you have this orchestration that's independent of the actual infrastructure, which really is a huge enabler for moving to a multi-cloud to take advantage of all of these things too. So I think it's a little bit of chicken and egg. I don't know if it was just coincidence or if the sort of push into pushing things more into the cloud and facilitating more multi-cloud prompted that. But I've certainly noticed a change in how people and vendors are offering up these orchestration services as well.
Well, Bill, I think the sort of fundamental thing that's underpinning a lot of this in terms of innovation unlock is that we're going through a sort of fundamental sea change of application architectures from, and we don't get to go through these very often. I started my career early in the client server days. It got transformed utterly by virtualization. I don't think of cloud as a major shift because was largely virtualization in somebody else's data center. But now with, call it what you want, cloud native, containerized applications, 12-factor apps, the application architecture is enabling multi-cloud as much as the existence of the clouds and the innovation occurring. So imagine I really like the data science from Google Cloud, but I need to do a bunch of this stuff on premises because it's real time in nature. Well, there's something called Anthos, which you can run on premises and run the Google tooling, or you can consume remote services if the latency within that specific part of an application is tolerable. So the ability to create these compound applications running in multiple locations is something that really is largely unlocked by containerized and microservice-based architectures. And a lot of people are they're sort of like dubious. There's no way that people are running elements of applications in multiple environments. And the reality is, and again, referencing some of the work that Steve's organization has done from surveying folks, is that a significant portion of people who are multi-cloud, which is, by the way, the majority of cloud users, are running like elements of a single application in multiple environments. People thought no one's ever going to do that. People are doing that today. So I don't want to undersell the fact that this major architectural shift is a big part of unlocking the ability to leverage more of the capabilities from a broader set. And you mentioned like EKS Anywhere or Tanzu or Anthos or OpenShift, or you get what I'm saying. There are what I like to think of as cloud operating systems that they can run anywhere. And because of that, you're able to run in multiple locations. You're able to break an application down into components, and you're able to put those components where it's best suited for cost reasons, elasticity reasons, latency reasons, whatever it happens to be. So there's a lot of really practical, good reasons to be multi-cloud because you can gain access to all of this great innovation using a new application architecture that's way more flexible and frankly, sort of speeds up your innovation beat rate.
If I could just chime in a little bit on that, you guys both bring up a great point, but one of the things I like to, again, I'm old now and I'm boring, and we think that this is all brand new paradigm, but fundamentally, we've done this multiple times before. We went from monolithic computing to client server. And so, I mean, Matt's example is exactly right on. We removed the database from the front end of the application. We've done that before. And what happened? Oh, we had multiple disparate systems, multiple disparate operating systems, and applications componentry, for lack of a better term, that executed in different physical spaces, and they all had to operate together. And the first problem that we found once we did that is that, well, conceivably that's wonderful and great, but how do I orchestrate and manage, and how do I see, just what's going on? And I think fundamentally that's kind of exactly where we are now. It's, yes, Matt's 100% right. Bill, you're 100% right. Things are going to go into different places at different times for different reasons. And even if we think it all out, where we are is, have we created an operational silo, right? As the database guy still just the database guy, and is the front end application on the DevOps side, and is the security guy completely in a vacuum that sits out there? And these are the problems that fundamentally cause us to not only have extensive or more downtime, and it costs us more money, because everybody's thinking, well, I'm a business unit and all I care about is that A goes to B. But they don't really understand the interdependencies of C, D, E, and F, that happen down the road. So I think we're at that kind of orchestration consolidation layer where we just need to have a much simpler and prettier view into the entirety of our stacks.
I mean, you guys have talked a lot about a lot of different things in terms of, the different providers out there, on-prem, public. So people listening might be wondering, how do I even do this? Where do I start? So, I'll open this up to all of you, but Bill, maybe you can start. Just how does somebody who wants to stand up a multi-cloud environment, where do they start? It seems like, there's a lot of options out there.
Well, the first place, the pattern that we see is most customers will start with optimizing their network. So you put infrastructure in place that you can create a security perimeter that you can connect to multiple clouds. Then we see typically they then add a couple key applications next to that, and then they'll put they'll update their security profile, and then start putting data closer to those apps. So it basically starts with assessing your infrastructure, looking at what network optimizations you can pull, and a lot of the times your network optimization will actually pay for all the rest of the steps. You'll be able to save enough money by putting your applications closer to your users and members of your digital supply chain in that first step, and then you just keep adding infrastructure and applications after that. So typically that's what the progression looks like that we've seen.
I was going to say you could call us and we'll help you build it. But seriously, I think something that Steve pointed out is really kind of important is that I do believe we're on sort of the early stages of control consolidation. And you can see that there are a lot of folks vying for control by creating these overarching layers with Kubernetes as sort of this great normalizer at sort of the core architectural level. And so a lot of the current control towers for Kubernetes-based workloads and infrastructure are starting to actually manage multiple different types of environments. And I do see that sort of the operating system vendors of the cloud are all vying for a degree of control over all of them, because they too recognize that this isn't going to be all ours, right? It's going to be an and situation. People are going to use our stuff and the other guy's stuff and the other girl's stuff. You get what I'm saying? So I think the industry's maturing, and like most of these waves of architectural disruption, there's a period of shakeout that occurs, and it typically lasts many, many years. But early on, what you really want is a vendor who's going to help create an ecosystem that you can gain access to all of the great innovation across the industry. And that's what we at Dell Technologies aim to do. I think the industry for a long time became over enamored with trying to replicate Apple's walled garden approach to business, right? Where it's kind of a winner takes all. I get you on this, all your music, all your entertainment. Therefore, I want to use all the other devices. That works well in a consumer environment and maybe occurs once in many lifetimes, but in sort of data center infrastructure, data center applications, the innovation rate is too high. There are too many people participating for you to say, I'm going to go all in on one provider. That's a huge mistake, especially in the early innings of an architectural shift. And so I think that the most important thing is to find a vendor who is not afraid of or is not against participating in an ecosystem, but instead is one who builds ecosystems. And I would say that, Dell has built a reputation over the years of building out these ecosystems. It's what we did with workstations early on to sort of defeat the super expensive proprietary Sun systems. We created an ecosystem, all of the vendors who created the applications that ran on workstations, and we built that ecosystem out and frankly toppled that sort of long-standing domination by Sun Microsystems way back when. And so that's what we're doing here is we're going to give everyone access to all of the innovation that the industry has, not just our own walled garden or somebody else's.
In terms of just standing this up, a lot of companies think they just need new technology to solve all their business problems and that's it. But how do you factor in kind of the business goals and objectives? Is that the place to start when you're thinking of deploying a cloud strategy? And Bill, we'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think, yeah, of course, you want to keep the business outcomes that you're trying to accomplish in mind. But I mentioned it a little earlier. I think one of the business outcomes that doesn't get enough attention is option value. I think we talked a lot about that it's a fast moving world and what the walled garden, no one's going to have this walled garden, but who's going to be participating in the solutions that you care about in the future is going to change. It's Zoom today, could go back to Cisco WebEx, it could be some new video conferencing tool in the future. Being really thoughtful about how you design your architecture for optionality is super important. So yes, of course, it starts with the outcomes. And I would just say one of the outcomes that has been underrated is option value and thinking about that option value because it matters a lot.
I'll say more forcefully, technology first is a losing strategy, right? It's all about the outcomes, right? And I think if you look back on some of these buzzword waves we've had over the past few years, I'll give you a good example. We don't talk about big data anymore, right? That was supposed to change the world. And everyone said, I need a Hadoop thing. That's not what happened. Everyone adopted that Hadoop thing, and then they realized that it's all failing, right? So that's an example of a technology first approach to IT planning and business planning. So again, forcefully, technology first is the wrong answer. It's what am I trying to solve for? And I think some of this sort of early on, I'm going to go all in on public cloud, and then you realize it's more costly than you may have predicted. Well, that's because you weren't thinking about, well, what's the business cost of this approach? And isn't it better to consider a, different horses for different courses type of strategy, which is frankly where everybody's landing, right? The public cloud continues to grow like crazy, but also the on-premises infrastructure world continues to grow. We've had a record year here at Dell Technologies, and in large part that's just increased investment in digital technologies, and that some of it's pandemic caused, of course, which is unfortunate, but a lot of it's just an acceleration of what we've been calling digital transformation, which is sort of codifying business process into software.
Could not agree more. As a matter of fact, I even wrote down what problem are we trying to solve. And I come back to oversimplifying by saying, well, we've walked this path before. And the reality is we are 10% digitized in our business world, maybe, right? So the headroom is so enormous. And you look at market shifts that are substantive, right? Everything was going to be Hadoop. That was going to solve the problems of the world. I was going to find every single needle in a haystack ever, and none of it worked, right? Because it was so overwhelmingly, terribly unwieldy, and you needed a data scientist, which did not exist, right? Except for a few years ago, it did not it wasn't a real thing. It was on the Jetsons, but now we needed data scientists to be able to do things. And so it's not to say we don't want to find that needle in a haystack. We do want to find the needle in it. We want to know that if we alter the prices of Charmin on a shelf in Poughkeepsie, that it's going to have some business outcome effect that with predictability. For example, of course we want to know that. We just want to make our businesses more efficient. But I think it all starts by fundamentally taking a look at what problem you're trying to solve, what are the interdependencies associated to that problem that will negatively affect that outcome. Because if you start with assuming the worst, which no one ever does, right? But if you, and I don't mean to be a pessimist, but if you do, then you catch these traps along the way. And I think, Bill, you brought up an excellent point with the ability, recognize that whatever you do today is malleable because the world is going to change around you, and to not be able to, one technology that I love right now is RPA. Because what is it doing? It's not doing anything any differently. It's just codifying basic boring human function that is error prone and nobody wants to do anyway, and you can't hire people and life is terrible, blah, blah, blah. So let's get a bot to do it out there. There's nothing wrong with that. But most companies aren't in a position to even adopt that type of thing. Right now, you've got to spend a lot of time and money and resources. So there's an industry that's been around for a little while that no one knew about. It's like Matt brought up the virtualization thing. Well, didn't IBM virtualize stuff 57 years ago, right? Didn't DEC do it 53 years ago? None of this stuff is new. So really, I guess the single piece of advice, if I could give to anyone attempting to go through this, is sit down, narrowly define what it is you're attempting to have come out of whatever it is you're doing, not go into whatever it is you're doing, right? What do you want to come out of it and build backwards from there, recognizing that no matter what your plan is, it's going to change.
We just have a minute left, and I'm just going to ask this last question. And thank you for bringing up the Jetsons reference, because this will tie in. So if you look up the future, when we have flying cars, or maybe just a few years into the future, what is the future of IT look like? Where do we go from here? Steve, we can start with you, and then Bill and Matt, and take it away.
At every iteration point, or every significant iteration point in IT over the course of history, things had to get harder before they got easier. And I think this is no different, right? This is to make something look simple, like Microsoft's a perfect example, right? They come out and make something look really simple to do, takes an enormous amount of complexity on the back end to hide that from you. And I think we're kind of in the exact same place. So my future is I'm going to eventually just retire. But for the rest of you that have to continue on, I guess it's, what hopefully digital transformation in a pandemic taught everybody in this business, if you still want to stay in this business, is you got to be flexible, right? Because all the things that you think are this is it, I got it nailed, you don't have it nailed. Something's going to come whack you in the side of the head. And you just got to kind of think through how, to Bill's point, how am I going to be able to shift and pivot to take advantage of new technologies that still help me attain my end goal?
My sort of, I'm going to pile in on what Matt said. I think we're at the early innings of this container-based applications, and that really allows applications to live in the architecture where they want to live much easier. And I think if you think about the impacts that has on infrastructure, we're at the very, very early innings of that. And I think as applications live where they want to live, some pretty amazing things are going to start to happen. Use cases that we haven't even thought of when truly the compute and the applications can live where they want to live.
All right, I'll try to close it out here, and I'm going to quote the CEO of Microsoft. By the way, the second largest public cloud vendor in the world said at their Ignite conference, I think it's called. But anyhow, he said, we have reached peak centralization. And by that, he stated, we've reached a point where we have hyper-centralized IT resources into hyperscale data centers, corporate data centers, etc. And this thing that I talked about early on, the speed of light, is pretty pesky. And things like robotic process automation are just one example of the automated future. And so to me, what we're going to see is a highly distributed, highly automated, cloud native, as in what Bill said, Kubernetes-based, container-based future. And we're in the early innings of that. And again, as a buyer of IT systems and services, you want to turn to somebody who's going to give you access to all of the innovation, not just my innovation. And so to me, the world is shifting from this notion of winner takes all to, ecosystems, especially early innings of major architectural shifts. So to me, the world's going to be more distributed. It's going to be more multi-cloud based, and it's going to deliver real-time digital experiences or automation. It's going to go everywhere. Entertainment, media, automotive, we talked about, transportation, manufacturing, etc. Right? So I'm really excited because it's really a technology-fueled future, and one that sees technology landing everywhere in the world around us.
Awesome. That was great. Thank you, Matt, Steve, and Bill, for this. You've given us a lot to think about the multi-cloud and the future of IT, and hopefully maybe we can check in again one day down the road and see where things have evolved. Thanks so much for being here. And now we're going to move to our next part of the presentation. We're going to take a closer look at the biggest trends in cloud computing. Please welcome Lee Suster, Principal Analyst at Forrester Research, to share an update on cloud transformation trends for 2022.
Thanks, Brian. I'm Lee Suster. I'm Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. I cover the public cloud, and I'm here today to talk to you about some of the top trends that we're seeing for 2022. And let's go through them at a high level. We're going to talk about how the era of lift and shift, which is to take your old data center and move it to the cloud, is really given way to a basic cloud native dynamic that we're seeing across the enterprise today. We're going to talk about the explosive growth in industry clouds, in other words, vertical industries that cloud providers are focusing special implementations for. We're going to talk about the multi-cloud trend, which was initially seen as something that was more inertial or happenstance, is now actually seen as strategic for a number of reasons that I'll go into. And we're going to talk about planet scale applications. And you might ask, well, doesn't the World Wide Web do that already? The answer is, well, kind of, sort of, but we're going to look at how it's going to come into a new level of maturity. So moving on, let's talk about lift and shift. Now, the early moves to the cloud were based on the assumption that you could save money, that you could shut down all or most of your data center, move it to the public cloud, have much cheaper run rates, and then be able to innovate more quickly and so on. And that was true up until a point, but the difficulty was that the early implementations were kind of an end around the existing infrastructure, then an attempt to move it. But what people typically found was that the so-called technical debt, the aging equipment now maybe virtualized in the cloud, has continued to be somewhat burdensome from the standpoint of innovation. So what we're seeing now is that organizations are looking to have a cloud native implementation. Now, cloud native has different meanings for different people. The way I'm using it here is more generic. It could be something that's a proprietary cloud vendor service that's available only from them. It could also be an open source effort that's coming out of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is a place where a lot of different big tech players come together, virtually all of them at some level or another, to collaborate on the core open source, which is sometimes offered directly as open source and sometimes the basis for commercial products. That transformation is something that we're seeing taking place across the enterprise. It's happening at some of the players who are typically involved in that. The financial services organizations, some large government entities are driving that. And now we're seeing organizations reach a decision point on how to then modernize their cloud based on these new cloud native technologies. And we expect that to be dominant in the period ahead. One reason why that's going to be the new norm is that application development has been automated to a great extent. You might have heard of the continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline, CI/CD. That's an effort to take assembly line type of methodologies and bring them to software development. That's been around for years, and it was actually took hold even before the cloud took hold. But the cloud actually gives it the ability to move much faster and much more in a much more scalable way. And of course, scalability is all about applications. You know, the world that we're in today, where the big cloud providers have given us always on, everywhere type of experiences, is actually driving development for all kinds of companies, both for their internal use as well as their customer-facing applications, to be able to match that. And so to do that, you need scalability. You actually have to bring in some of the cloud technologies, particularly the cloud native technologies that provide that kind of scale. And of course, stability is there. Not everybody has the same resources as a hyperscaler to maintain that kind of uptime round the clock, with some recent exceptions perhaps with some outages. But that stability is increasingly important. The cloud provides that in ways that on-premises or legacy data center technology typically could not at least without a lot of investment up front from the various users. And we see containers as driving that. Now, container is a kind of a software abstraction, a kind of a narrow subset of an operating system that enables an application to be packaged up with that underlying technology in ways that it has little or no dependency on the infrastructure it runs on. So if you can develop an application in a containerized environment with all of its dependencies built in, it can actually run in a variety of different contexts. It can run on premises, it can run in the public cloud. And we see containers being embraced by developers, and we think that that's going to hit a majority of development in the coming year. And that is really an indicator of this trend towards cloud native that I talked about. It's going to become prevalent. The next trend I want to talk about is the explosive growth in industry clouds. Now, industry clouds have not just been invented. They've been around for some years. I was looking around, I'm preparing for this discussion, and saw that back in 2015, an early iteration of cloud for financial services. What's happened today is that with a much greater mature public cloud, the public cloud providers are understanding that while they might be at rough parity in terms of the services that they can provide, where they can differentiate is to go into a particular industry and tackle some of the common problems that exist. Financial services is one example where there are a number of regulatory and compliance issues in a variety of different national or regional contexts, European Union, United States, and so forth. Having a cloud provider tackle some of those issues up front, as well as paying attention to some of the unique needs of a particular industry, such as transaction processing, obviously, for financial services, sets up a competition around industry clouds. And what was initially a kind of a marketing veneer around the efforts towards industry clouds now has a much richer content, much more native service cloud integration. And the same trends exist in some of the other industries we could talk about. Telecommunications, healthcare is a major one as well, and a variety of different manufacturing implementations by different cloud providers. We think that that's really going to take off in the months ahead with much greater service integration, much greater technical oomph involved than there might have been in the past, what was more of a marketing proposition. So this is going to be a new cloud battleground. We're going to see the competition really sharpen up as we go. To sum it up, the era of general purpose cloud computing is now well established. The question is, how then does my industry or my organization or my type of government entity take advantage of that in a way that makes for a stronger internal performance, however that's measured, whether it's in terms of profit or efficiency and what have you. The trend that I want to talk about next is the trend towards multi-cloud. Now, multi-cloud, as I mentioned, was initially seen as a kind of a try something and see what works type of scenario. In other words, one public cloud provider is knocking on the door. There's an initial use case for it. It's faster to get going, an analytics application perhaps. than it might have been on premises within the data center. So that's something that people have early on moved to. Well, at the same time, another set of applications that seemed more aligned with the offerings from a different cloud pull a different business unit in another direction. And from the standpoint of a multinational organization or international organization, you have different geographies and different restrictions around that in terms of where and how data can move, also led to a multi-cloud scenario. That kind of inertia-driven multi-cloud is today given way to what we see as something as much more strategic, particularly among the major enterprises. And you can see some of the numbers here that we've discussed. The multi-cloud isn't just a second cloud provider, a primary and a secondary. It's very often 3, 4, even 5, and the numbers bear that out. And this is something that we think is very interesting because it indicates for us that we're moving beyond the scenario in which the multi-cloud was a kind of almost an accident to one in which it's now strategic. Why is it strategic? Well, if you're a financial services organization, risk management is a top concern, and you want to mitigate the risk of dependence on any one vendor. Now, you have a choice to make. If I go to the public cloud or keep everything on premises, there's a big cost differential. So if I want to move to the public cloud, but if I wanted to have a second public cloud in addition to that, replicating that exactly, that could be cost prohibitive as well. So what do I do here? Do I spend the same amount of money on 2 different clouds? What we're seeing is a different kind of pattern where someone might say, okay, this is our primary cloud provider for core infrastructure, but we want to open up a different cloud relationship with another cloud because it actually provides, it's the next iteration of a set of services that we already obtain from that company, whether it's office services or enterprise resource planning, that we want to move in that direction as well. So we'll have 2 different clouds, and the idea isn't necessarily that they can be that portable, but they can actually mean that you can lean one way or another as time comes on. So if at contract time, if there's another alternative, you can begin to do that. Multi-cloud can be useful from the standpoint of portability as well, owing to new technologies around what we call at Forrester multi-cloud container platforms. And the multi-cloud container platforms are software platforms that build upon that take as a given the containerization of applications that I described earlier and allow them to run in a variety of different cloud contexts. So you could run them on premises, you could run them in cloud A, you could run them in cloud B, and you could run them in cloud C. And there will always be some differences and particularities around the way in which they interact with the underlying cloud provider services. But in fact, they do provide a common target for application development and also provide a common context for the operators as well. So that's enabling multi-cloud at that end. So there's vendor mitigation risk, and there's also the interest in portability. And of course, for some of the biggest players whose applications must be available all the time, worldwide, they have in fact deployed applications almost simultaneously through not all their applications, but their most strategic customer-facing applications in different clouds worldwide at scale, so that if they need to divert workloads from one to the other, they can do so seamlessly. That's a fairly small subset of organizations that have the need to do that and and for whom it's a worthwhile investment to do so. But it's nevertheless quite a significant trend that we're seeing. And as costs tend to come down in that area, we may see others move in that same direction. On this last trend that I've discussed here today, painless planetary applications. Now, I mentioned applications have been globally scalable thanks to the web for some time, but it hasn't been that easy. The containerization of applications has enabled orchestration at scale, and there's a number of cloud-native technologies that enable that. You may have heard the term Kubernetes, which is actually part of the multi-cloud container platform products and services that I mentioned earlier. That has enabled applications to work at scale. In fact, it's derived from hyperscaler technologies about global applications. Nevertheless, there are inherent limitations in the way those things have played out. You still, in the end, are dependent on a given cloud provider, wherever that may be, and in particular scalability and orchestration capabilities of that cloud that may or may not reach in every corner of the planet with exactly the way you want, at least not without a lot of rework and a lot of adaptation for a particular application for a different context. And that's why what we're seeing today is something that's going to be different, and that applications are going to be automated at scale beyond the limits of the kind of orchestration platforms that I described, and something that's more focused on the edge itself, what's actually happening in the browser. And that's something that's different. It means that application developers will be able to target the isolates within the browsers, such as V8 and Chromium, the Jamstack, also WebAssembly, which is an up-and-coming technology, which again focuses on the inherent capability that's at the endpoint. And that provides a comprehensive platform for application development. So it literally can run almost everywhere. Now, it's not going to be applicable and useful for every single application out there, but for certain massive global public-facing applications, it's going to be, we think, an important target for development. And we think that that is going to really usher in a new scale of planet-scale apps. And that's what I have for today. I want to thank you all for joining us, and I appreciate the time you've given us. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. That was a great presentation. And a big thank you to our audience and to Dell Technologies for making today's event possible. Again, thanks all for joining, and have a great day.